Welcome, welcome, everyone. Thank you for your patience. We were just making sure the Zoom was set up properly. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. We're going to give another 30 seconds or so just so that folks can get settled in. I'm going to ask my colleagues also to monitor the waiting room and just let people in as they arrive. All right, so let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second webinar of the Digital Justice Grants Program Fall Webinar Series. What is Digital Justice? Reflections from ACLS Grantees. If you missed the first webinar, which occurred a few weeks ago and was a general information session about the program, its ethos, its design, and also about some of the application components, that recording is now currently available on the ACLS Digital Justice Supplementary Materials webpage. So you can check that out. Feel free to also share that with colleagues. My name is Kiana Nurse. I am Senior Program Officer of IDEA Programs and Program Lead of the Digital Justice Grants Program. Now, before I introduce our very esteemed interlocutors, I want to quickly say a few words about the intention behind this webinar series, which is now in its third year, believe it or not. It feels like we just started this the other day. So we initially imagined this webinar series to go beyond simply providing general information about the program and to instead intervene within what I think is the aptly named quote unquote hidden curriculum of academia, which you all know is those sort of unstated yet deeply influential expectations about how one is to exist as a scholar. And those can range from the professional to the intellectual, not only in one's specific areas of study, but also in how one articulates their work to others. And I think the grant application is an arena where those unstated expectations are pretty ironically on full display, right? And in this is where the webinar series comes in as a way of kind of making plain how to approach the application for this particular program in a really transparent and thoughtful way. So not only did we, meaning the team at ACLS behind this effort, want to provide a forum for applicants to directly engage with former reviewers of our digital grants programs, but we also wanted to have these sessions be useful and generative as you craft your application materials. And that's why the selected topics, taken as a whole, really try to be attentive to some of the challenges that I've seen applicants face over the years, as well as some of the areas that reviewers have expressed that they would like ACLS to provide a little bit more coaching on. So today's session, What is Digital Justice, is in service of that mission. The number one question that I often get when folks are considering whether or not they should apply, or if their project, which may have a few digital elements like a website or a podcast, they're trying to determine if it's a good fit, right? If they should submit an application. And so the primary question I often get is, what is a digital justice project and how is that any different than a quote unquote more traditional digital humanities project? So what does this program actually fund? Again, you can find some of my reflections and remarks about that question in the recorded general information session from a few weeks ago. But today's session, which features 3 interlocutors who have all been reviewers over the years for previous digital justice competitions, as well as grantees themselves. I hope this session will do a better job of showing rather than simply telling, since our interlocutors will not only talk about their own digital justice projects, but also provide some insights on how proposed digital projects for this competition can best articulate their alignment with the larger values and ethos of this program. So with that said, I'd like to introduce our first interlocutor, Jakia Carruthers. Jakia Carruthers is an assistant professor of English and Africana Studies at Drexel University. She is a scholar of Black feminism and cultural studies, and her research attends to political expression within literature, media, and visual art alongside matters of race, gender, and state discipline. Our second interlocutor is Stephen Davis. Stephen Davis is an associate professor of history at the University of Kentucky. He is author of the ANC's War Against Apartheid, Umkhonto. You're going to have to correct me on that, Stephen. I'm so sorry. Umkhonto we Sizwe and the Liberation of South Africa. Hopefully you can do so when you tell us about your project. He is currently principal investigator of two DH projects. Bitter Aloe, a research group that applies machine learning models to human rights testimonies, and the Personal Rights to Political, which developed a handwritten text recognition tool for transcribing anti-apartheid solidarity letters. And our last interlocutor is Cynthia Wang, who is an associate professor of communication studies at California State, LA. She is interested in the impact of communication technologies and digital media on social relations, cultural practices, and power dynamics, particularly in relation to time and temporality. She has also done work around prison pedagogy and restorative justice, and is the founder of The Archive, an interactive digital LGBTQ storytelling map, which was a recipient of an ACLS Digital Justice Grant in 2022. So now that I've provided the formal introductions for our interlocutors, I would like to sort of do a round robin in some ways to get our attendees familiar with your actual projects. And so if each of you could go around and sort of share a brief summary of your project for about 2 or 3 minutes or so.
I'll be alphabetical. Maybe that'll be the way we do it. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So again, I'm Jakia Carruthers, and I am co-managing editor of Resound and Resist, which when we first applied was known as Decriminalizing Survival. It's an online open access digital archive dedicated to curating and sharing materials that were created by participants in feminist mobilizations against the carceral state. And that's historical, going back to, and in a few cases, the 19th century up to now. And the archive itself has several goals, but one of the main intentions is to amplify underdocumented anti-carceral informations. That includes defense campaigns, one-off grassroots research projects, publications, entire organizations. And we're uniquely trying to amplify those that were forcefully submerged or co-opted or just generally devalued within mainstream narratives of gender liberation and anti-violence and prison resistance. I'm gonna stop there.
Thank you.
So I'm Steve Davis. I'm the co-principal investigator of the Personal Rights to Political. So the genesis of that project was a very large collection of handwritten letters that were authored by families whose loved ones had been caught up in some part of the apartheid carceral state in South Africa. So the letters were generated as part of a welfare scheme that was run by the largest anti-apartheid organization of its day, which was based in London. And what the letters capture is everyday life in struggle families. So it's a really invaluable record of the contributions that families made during this time. And that's particularly important because oftentimes families are not identified as sort of frontline activists, but they play an enormously important role in sustaining the activism of their loved ones and sustaining their loved ones while they were sort of ensnared in the carceral state. So what we did was we used a vision learning model to create a handwritten text recognition tool called Caracol that can be used by this archive and any archive to automate the transcription of large volumes of handwritten material.
Hello. My name's Diane Turner. I don't know if I'm supposed to be in here or not. I haven't gotten the grant, but I can talk about what we're trying to do here. I'm the curator.
Sorry, Diane, can I interrupt you for just a second? So the format of this is actually, we're gonna have the interlocutors engage in
Oh,
discussion.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
We'll have questions at the end of at the second half of the session.
Okay, okay. All right. Sorry about that.
No problem. Thank you.
My screen popped up. That's why I was up there. Oh, wow. Okay, sorry about that.
Hi, everyone. My name is Cynthia Wong, and my project is called it's called The Archive, and it's spelled ARQIVE. So it's a essentially an LGBTQ map, both historically and sort of trying to map stories through time and space. And the whole sort of idea behind it is because a lot of queer stories have been sort of erased and a lot of the spaces have been taken over and gentrified throughout history. What we've really tried to do is create a platform. So it's sort of live. It's, thearchive.com. Um, and we programmed it so that anyone can sort of add their queer story and pin it exactly where that happened. So it's like, oh, I had my first kiss here, pin it and tell a story. So we sort of were able to build a pretty robust like search function and basic functionality to do that. So that's in a nutshell, and I'm happy to talk more about it as we get into the questions.
Wonderful. Thank you all for that. I know the elevator pitch can be an annoying exercise to do, but I definitely appreciate the brevity, and I'm sure that we'll sort of delve more deeply into certain facets of your project once we get into the discussion. I just wanted everyone in the room to sort of have a primer of the projects that you worked on, particularly obviously the one that has been funded through the Digital Justice Grants Program, but also I think it's a good entryway point to thinking about the broader aim of this session, which, as I mentioned at the top of our time together, is to sort of show rather than tell, and to really think concretely about this relationship between the form and the content of the project, right? Which is, I think, a really great way of thinking about what is digital justice. And so the first question that I want to ask you all is sort of about the relationship between the digital and justice within your projects, right? So how do our understandings of justice, or the understandings of justice that you've articulated in your project, inform how you mobilize the digital tools and methods? And if you'd also like to enter that question by way of thinking about sort of the relationship between why you picked certain digital methods or tools for the particular content that you're exploring, I think that's also another way that we could sort of enter that question as well.
I'm happy to start. I was like, I'm not sure we're just going in order. I think for me, I've always just been really interested in communication technologies and these sort of opportunities as well as the constraints of technologies that we have. So my project, I just wanted to map stories. Like it was like 2009 or something. I was in Hong Kong and looking for a gay bar, and the only thing that I found were these like lists from the 90s on like Yahoo groups or something. And so, I went to the location and there was not a gay bar there. And I'm like, well, this is kind of a problem. And so at the time, I also was just thinking about mapping and space and place and things like that. So I was sort of really interested in um, seeing how we can use the digital form to sort of make visible some of the maybe stories that have not been told, or some of the spaces that have had to remain hidden for whatever reason. So I think a lot about the way that, like, I think about the affordances of digital tools, sort of credit to Nancy Bain about how the internet has afforded things like reachability and accessibility and searchability of things, as well as this sort of asynchronous and synchronous and instant sort of communication that goes on, and then how we can sort of like kind of leverage that to tell stories that have been essentially and historically gate kept from the mainstream. And so I was really sort of thinking along those lines when I was designing the project.
Right about if I is a check thing is really important because I think that sort of informed the ways that we were envisioning the idea of digital justice too. So, initially, our broad understanding of digital justice was that it's a digital project whose themes and content are attuned to issues related to social justice. And that was clear in terms of our themes and our content. We were studying feminist resistance that had an anti-oppressive and anti-carceral bend that organized their work according to an understanding that certain systems, criminalization, gender violence, racial capitalism, et cetera, were unjust. So the kind of analysis that we were documenting was itself pointed toward a read of justice. But what we understood too was that the terms of that, what Cynthia is referring to as gatekeeping, that the kind of like the force of that submergence of these movements within mainstream analysis, even within, some radical sectors, was itself also unjust, that there's something that's happening there, and not just for quaint, reasons that are related to documentation and to memory, but because the silence and the enforcement of that silence might have intentionally in some cases and unintentionally in others defanged the power of the theory and the practice against state discipline that these formations that we're trying to unearth or at least document in a particular way were forwarding. So there are multiple levels to our thinking about digital justice and like the why we're doing what we're doing. And so much of that came from our understanding around Black feminist praxis, things that we learned far before and far out of our interest in digital tools and methods. And in fact, I don't know if Stephen and Cynthia too were seed grant recipients, but our project was, and we were very, very new to digital tools and to archive information and aggregation. So ultimately, we spent a lot of our early grant period learning technical vocabulary, and with that, determining ways that like broader struggles around digital justice, that's data, surveillance, digital carcerality, power relations within, digital like publics, information manipulation, and all these other sorts of things within the digital sphere might be important and might need to be considerations for we were making our choices too. And like very importantly, it meant figuring out what a digital infrastructure for something called a community archive, because I think we were really taking that for granted. We were thinking about that in a kind of analog way, or we were thinking about the ways that we might do that in different spheres. And then we were not correct that building such an infrastructure would require their considerations, including the ones connected to digital justice just a bit ago. So we did a lot of research, we did a lot of close study. We met with folks like Michelle Caswell, Alex Poole, the folks at the South Asian American Digital Archive, and so forth. So for us, digital justice, again, refers to the content of our, but also the sort of intentioned and intended outcomes of.
Thank you for sharing that. And if I just could quickly jump in, I do want to come back to that, I think maybe later in the session, because one of the things that's perhaps unique about the Digital Justice Grants program is that we do offer these seed grants, right? And it is in a lot of ways an opportunity where, we invite experimentation, we invite this to be a kind of introduction for scholars who are interested in kind of incorporating more digital tools and methods into their work. So I am very interested to kind of have a conversation about that learning process of, how you even got ready for the seed grant by thinking critically about the digital and what specifically it added, not simply to the content that you were interested in sort of centering in your project, but also how like the whole sort of ecosystem around digital tools. And I think we'll talk about this in the next session around data ethics, which I also encourage people to attend, but sort of what happens to your data when you use particular tools, especially proprietary ones, things that we take for granted, right? And so thank you for surfacing that. I just wanted to say that out loud as something to come back to. But Stephen, would you mind going next?
Yeah, sure. So the genesis of our project, as I mentioned earlier, was this collection of letters. I had known about the collection for a number of years, going back to my dissertation fieldwork, where I was interviewing ex-combatants that were part of the African National Congress's armed wing. And as I was conducting interviews, I was becoming more and more aware of the family dynamics that weren't being represented in the literature. I just wasn't seeing much of it. The story of the anti-apartheid struggle is very often told through the autobiographies of elites within the struggle. But there's this whole backstage that is going on within families that really wasn't making it into the public sphere. It wasn't being recognized. So, I wondered why this archive of letters wasn't being utilized, because it was such a rich record of these contributions and these sacrifices that people made. And in conversation with our archival partners, we learned about the sensitivities attached to working with records of everyday life. Oftentimes contains a lot of intimate details. There's personal identifying information that make it really tricky to kind of open up an archive like that. So I was kind of confronted with this paradox. I mean, there's this amazing material, but there are all these limitations that prevent it from making its way into the public sphere, into literature, into public consciousness. So as we began to investigate developments in machine learning and in vision learning, we began to realize that there are ways to safely open the door to that archive in a very controlled way that allows our partner within South Africa to hold the lion's share of power over access and how this material is presented and represented. So that's when we began working on Caracol, which was our HDR tool. There's a whole other part of the project that I didn't mention that relates to privacy. So we created an automated way to identify personal identifying information and mask it, and also ways of collecting large amounts of structured data from text that can be used to tell the story in the aggregate. So rather than conducting close readings of individual letters, you can see the strain on hundreds, if not thousands, of households during the time of year when school fees are due. And you're missing a primary breadwinner because that person is being detained or is incarcerated. So there are ways of making this archive available through digital means, making it legible as data that weren't possible before. So that's kind of where we stood on this question of digital justice.
Yeah, I think, what I'm hearing across all three projects is sort of the ways that digital tools allow you to obviously make certain things visible that were sort of invisible or silenced before, but the justice piece of it comes in to it, not simply just because of the subject matter, but also the very intentional politics that you have to navigate in terms of whether or not and the extent to which things should remain invisible, or sort of dancing around surveillance, taking into consideration sort of issues of privacy, and then also sort of thinking about the integrity of like the data that you were using over time and who will have access to it. And so I think that's a really good sort of thread, or at least a set of considerations that folks should think about in terms of thinking about like the specific tools that they're using and why the particular relationship that it will have to your content, and also these sort of larger questions around justice. One of the things though that I think I talked a little bit about in the general information session is that, justice is a very big concept. We all have different sort of ideas or definitions of what it is, but at least within the confines of this program, we have tried to center reparative and redistributive aspirations, right? And so an example of the redistributive aspirations is that we really try to focus on projects or fund projects that are also engaging in some kind of capacity building work as well in terms of, undergoing the project itself. And so how is a project-based understanding of capacity building, either building up the technological infrastructure of a community or a place? How are you bringing more folks to the project and sort of doing a skill training, or sort of, again, just bolstering the capacity for whatever local communities that you're engaging with to do this work on their own terms? And so that's been a real sort of clear value of the program in terms of how we think about digital justice. And so I want to ask, in what ways do your own projects engage in or forward a kind of reparative or redistributive, work?
I'd be happy to jump in. So I think we primarily work within the field of machine learning, and when machine learning is applied in service to digital justice, it can act as a labor multiplier. So the custodian of this collection of letters, the Mayabuye Center, is the largest repository of anti-apartheid material in the world. But you would never guess that looking at the resources that are available to them. So like a lot of archives in Africa and elsewhere, their budgets are pretty poorly matched to the tasks that they have set before them. So what we wanted to do was to create a way for records to be rendered as machine readable, and then they could be rendered as data, but not impose a significant burden on their allocations of labor. What we were hoping is that if we could automate this process, we could free up archivists to do what they do best, which is to focus on sort of higher order interpretive questions and you know the the sort of public engagement questions that rely on an archivist's expertise, and kind of reduce the amount of routine work that kind of taxes an archive that has a small staff and a small budget. So that was part of the kind of reparative restorative work. The other part was sort of socio-technological, optical character recognition, which is rendering TypeScript into machine readable text. It's been around for a very long time, and its kind of trajectory, its arc of development was much more steep at an earlier stage. So it developed really quickly. Handwritten text recognition has not really achieved levels of accuracy that are comparable to OCR until relatively recently. So over that span of several decades, what you see are large numbers of data sets being produced from typeset records, which oftentimes reflect either official sources or elites because they typically have access to the typeset word. They have the means of production of typeset material. And handwritten material, which oftentimes is being generated by folks who are marginalized or have less power or access, those data sets weren't being made. So beyond this letters collection, we discovered that this tool has applicability throughout the global South and in the post-colonial world, where handwritten records more often reflect voices of people that are outside the centers of power and wealth.
I can talk a little bit about that too, just sort of building off of that. I think this is a really like a really important part of the justice piece is that reparative and redistributive aspirations that we have. For us, for this particular project, we so to uh, we were actually, I think, we got the development grant. So it wasn't seed funding. This project had already been going for maybe 5 or 6 years before that, but we really needed an infusion of funding to like keep going and to sort of expand the work that we're doing. So just fundamentally, the archive sort of talking about queer history and LGBTQ issues and movements. Ours is not local. Ours is very global. Right now, we're kind of our content is sort of localized. Like the concentration of our content is localized to Los Angeles because that's just where we are. But we also have had a lot of like because like here in the US, for better or worse, we have conversations about queerness. We have these conversations. In other parts of the world, these conversations don't happen. So people who are queer or are struggling with their sexuality, it's very invisible. And so we really were trying to combat the invisibility of like people and of queerness in different parts of the world. A lot of, I was like going to jump back to the last question a little bit, but we take like anonymity, we do approximate location. We didn't want to put a pin in like, you know, Russia saying there is a gay spot here, come raid us now or something, right? Like so we really were like thinking about what were the ramifications of having like this digital record out there. So those are, I think, some of the considerations to that we were really careful about. Um, I think for us, it was a question of whose voice was getting out there. And it wasn't just like identity-based voices, because we know that like a lot of, queer people of color and queer women of color's voices and trans voices are often sort of rendered invisible in sort of more mainstream narratives of queerness. But we were also sort of, I also think of it as opportunity based. So, like, who gets to tell the story of Stonewall, right? Versus we have a story on the site of somebody in Kuwait who, like, kissed like her first girlfriend, right? And that was like this sort of beautiful story that otherwise wouldn't have been told. So it's both sort of like, what do the history books, right, talk about, or what does like, even mainstream queer narratives versus these personal narratives that otherwise wouldn't get a voice. Um, the other thing I wanted to sort of point out in our project is that we actually, and I don't, maybe this fits into the reparative stuff. Our entire site right now, when we built it from the ground up, maybe like 6 years ago, it's completely designed and developed by our students at Cal State LA, our undergrad and graduate students at Cal State LA, and that's something that we're really sort of proud of. We have mostly first generation students, um, and we're a Hispanic serving institution, so that aspect of it and being able to sort of give our students this opportunity to participate in the actual development of this site was really meaningful to us. So I'll sort of maybe pause there for now.
And I don't have so much to add, just because I think that both Cynthia and Stephen have articulated really beautifully um, what I would say is the sort of redistributive power of what we were trying to do, which is to say epidemic. We were trying to widen what counts feminist organizing against criminalization. We were trying to illuminate critiques from folks in formations whose social position, but again, not as Cynthia said, not just in terms of like how they were identified in the world, but also folks in formations whose political logics and whose resistance practices were routinely discounted. So it's not just, like neutral documentation of fraught histories. We understand our archive as articulating like very directly like multi-variant anti-carceral analysis. We understand it as honestly a usable resource of practical guidance from like a long history of grassroots movement building. Like we hope that people will visit this and say, oh, they did what? As there's really wonderful projects like 1 Million Experiments or other kinds of abolitionist kind of like aggregations of like the kinds of things that you can do to avoid and to transform a world that does not rely on policing and prisons and punishment and carcerality in the ways that we have for so long. Um, this is a set of those experiments, a set of those 1 million experiments. And I talked about this at an ACLS convening. what we really hope to do is to make sure that these articulations happening, not just in terms of like the visible out, like a memory of the visible outcomes, but also the kind of like behind the scenes um, business. The way I phrased it and borrowed from my colleague was that we're not trying, air dirty laundry, but we are trying to be frank about dirty lessons. So like just telling the story and doing with that, for example, hypertext or other kinds of things to show that there are layers to everything, that all stories are complicated and they are contested. So in that way, again, we're sort of redistributing epistemic power. And then, of course, in terms of the reparative work of it, given that it's a usable source of practice, like we're making a case for abolition feminism. We're seeking to repair damage from what Beth Ritchie calls, the prison nation and the matrix of violence to which so many people are vulnerable. So it's about offering models and raw lessons. It's about, coalition building. And I think well, hopefully I'll have a chance to talk a little bit more about community partnership. But I'm really learning a lot from you right now, Cynthia and Stephen, about other ways that community partnership can happen and that community power beyond what we've done. Maybe we'll get to that later.
Actually, I think that's a wonderful segue to that very question, because one of the things that's very understated, and we did a session on this last year called Operationalizing Digital Justice Projects, that took a deep dive into the often neglected parts of the applications, like the budget, the work plan, and the timeline, and sort of thinking through how even those elements reflect or don't reflect the kind of larger values around, reparative or redistributive work, and how that itself is a space that can or not articulate the values around justice that the project is trying to engage in. And so community partnership is certainly central to that. And so I'm wondering if each of you could speak a little bit about, the community partnerships that support your work. If you could give us a little bit of history of how you form those things, but also how you, I guess, thought about articulating that relationship within the confines of, for this grant, and thinking about equity issues, labor issues, proper distribution, where things should be housed, sort of how you form partnerships across resource and power differentials. So anything of the sort.
With this one, and I'll start with, I guess, the question about the language that's used in the proposal, or at least that's one of the ways that we tried to begin from the time of the proposal and onward, and certainly got developed as, the project sort of iterated. So we understood our community partners as research and archival partners, and in that way, I think that's sort of some of what Stephen and his team are also doing. But it's most of the formations that we're archiving, many of them are defunct, but lots of them are still operating. And even within the defunct historical formations, most of the organizers are still available to partner with us. And in doing so, they are not just like helping us, like not being our, junior staff, anything like that, but really taking leadership over the curation and collection of materials. They're making suggestions for their own metadata. They're providing their own descriptions and curatorial statements regarding what's included and why. And again, like doing some more meta documentation of the conversations around what gets included and why. So that's been really interesting. We make sure that we are in conversation with community research and archival partners to guide political principles, intellectual principles, and for the most part, because we are already in community, we're the three co-PIs for this project are coalition feminist organizers. Like these are our friends. Some of these folks are our friends, or they are folks that we studied or learned from. So some of this kind of back and forth in this building has been um, so organic because it's been a little bit informal. But as we were starting to like build the infrastructure, as I was saying before about like, oh wait, a digital community archive like might need to be built in a very specific kind of way. um, then that sort of like distribution of like real kind of intellectual and political partnership and contestation and that sort of thing was showed up in that infrastructure too. So that was, how we're creating the instructions or how we're creating and what we're saying within our collections guide. Um, and I do want to say that like, um, though I'm talking a lot about political and intellectual principles, it does occur to me that we were in trying to be fair about labor and about resources. A lot of the digital mm, mobilization, like a lot of the actual digital labor, um, was work that we, the co-PIs, were doing and organizing. Um, and I'm not sure that I'm so glad to be thinking about this right now, and to be thinking a little bit more about how to share even decisions about digital tools and methods. Like, again, there are certain things that we're all kind of in agreement around fundamentally because of the kinds of theories and practice that inform what we're doing. Um, and we've been transparent about everything along the way, but in terms of skill sharing, there's certainly some more room to do that kind of thing. And toward, Kiana's point earlier regarding the seed grant and the learning that has to happen and the learning curve that is a part of building a project from scratch or just figuring out some of what you're doing. It's certainly messy sometimes, but I want to give just, I guess, a little anecdote um, around the ways in which we were trying to come into a clearer understanding of what the infrastructure for a community archive looked like. We ended up having to revise our budget to reconsider compensation for community research partners. Um, a couple times we had to revise our budget and like shift things around to make sure that we were, we can just do something else to pay for this technology. People who are doing laborers need more money. And what was so beautiful was that Kiana, that Dr. Nurse was so amazing and so flexible. And I remember an email where you were like, yes, you should pay your community partners more. That sounds like a wonderful idea. And that kind of feedback was obviously helpful, but it was also a breath of fresh air because there are ways in which institutions sometimes can be hostile to community partnerships, and that hostility manifests in bureaucracy. Um, and we've discussed, ways to try to get around that, but it's certainly not easy. So it just meant a lot that ACLS um, did not, put forth that bureaucratic hindrance and also shared our values with respect to distribution and to.
Okay,
I can go ahead. Cynthia, do you want to go?
you go ahead.
Okay. Um, so in regards to community partnership, our partner organization was the Maya Bouye Center. And throughout the course of the grant, we've had really in-depth ongoing conversations about the nature of the work and us articulating what was possible and then trying to harmonize that with their mission and their capabilities. The last thing we wanted to do was to impose an additional burden on an already overburdened organization. We actually wanted to do the opposite. So being mindful of their limitations and also being respectful of what they wanted to do and then incorporate that into the heart of the project, into the kind of reason for the project was really important. One of the difficulties I think of working across the north-south digital divide is this unequal flow of data from the global south to the global north. There's this notion of digital safaris where research teams and institutions from the global north will go to Africa. They'll digitize a bunch of materials, and then the data will end up ultimately residing on servers in Paris, in London, in New York, wherever. And it's not only the digital material leaving servers in Africa that's the issue, it's the power being shifted to control access and to shape how that material is represented. That oftentimes goes with it. So about midway through the seed grant funding, we realized we were dealing with a much more complicated set of privacy concerns than we originally planned. I'll be honest with you, I thought this would be a really easy project and we would just go down there, do a mass digitization, and then that would just be so great. It would open up so many research possibilities. But we really needed to slow down, take into consideration the reputational risks and just sort of political risks of a data breach for our partner institution, and then redesign our workflow in consideration of that. So what we did was we started to compartmentalize access to the letters themselves. So in consultation with Maya Bouye, we created a pretty complicated workflow that limited access to the content of the letters to our South African partners, and then allowed our North American partners, myself and William Mattingly, the ability to develop and implement software solutions for them. So that was a really kind of ongoing challenge throughout the grant, was just sustaining the conversation, making sure that we were adaptive and responsive to the needs of our partner. The other thing is we changed the leadership structure. So in the midst of kind of navigating our way through this really complicated privacy landscape, we realized we didn't have a familiarity with what was going on within the organization and on the ground more broadly in South Africa. So we brought on another PI. So we have three co-PIs, Stanley Salo, who had spent 17 years at this archive, but had recently left to start his own information management consultancy for archives and heritage institutions. So he was brought in as a co-equal leader of the program, and his input has been absolutely essential in kind of redesigning the project as we go. I mean, if there's any bit of advice I can impart to applicants and grantees, it's remaining open to change and accepting that the environment that you're working in is really unpredictable. But that unpredictability is a real source of intellectual joy, because it really stimulates you to kind of think about how the digital can overcome these challenges. It's not an obstacle. It's actually a real great opportunity to challenge yourself to think about how the digital can kind of solve some of these problems in an interesting way.
So yeah, it's so wonderful to be in communication with both of you and all you all on this side as well. Um, I think ours was a little bit different in terms of our community partners are it felt like they were less partners and more just trying to be part of community. So I've done like LGBTQ activism for a long time, even before I was at Cal State LA, and certainly way before I started this project. And so I sort of like Jakia, you were saying that a lot of your community partnerships were just kind of informal. You were friends. Like I felt the same way. So throughout the granting period, we did do like some sort of formal things. We were on a panel with the One Foundation and worked with them a little bit. We have sort of ongoing relationships with like the One Archive and other archives sort of around town. But really for us, our community is anyone who sort of has a not so straight story to tell. And so we sort of did a lot of like one of the pieces that we built into the grant was like public relations. You know, like how do we sort of go and let people know what we're doing and let the community know um, sort of what we're doing. We did spend some time reaching out to other people who are doing queer mapping projects. And so we're actually at this point 2 years out from funding. We've actually had a lot of changes. Our main sort of co-PI in tech, our computer science faculty, he passed away, and so we really had to reshift a lot of our tech stuff in the last sort of year or so. Um, like you were both saying, we also had to shift our budget a little bit. One of the things that we built in was a mobile app, and we ran into several challenges in trying to get the app A developed and B like on the Apple and the Android platforms. So we reshifted and just went to develop like a mobile browser app. Um, I'm trying to look at some of my notes. So yeah, I think our community partnerships, I literally I was just here pulling up my old grant application to see how we articulated like the community partnerships, just so you all like have an idea. You know, we really pushed on or leaned on like internal partnerships. So we really made this kind of an interdisciplinary educational and pedagogical process for our students. We really like we're really like a heavily teaching institution. So we really value like bringing our students into our research, bringing our students into what we're doing. We had a lot of different components to it. Like, so we had the tech component, but we also had the content component, and the community component. And we were just trying to get all those to kind of work together. For those of you who are like thinking about, you know, doing a grant and in the community partners piece, I think in my grant, I'm just saying I listed like my internal, like the internal partnerships that I had, and then I listed the external partnerships, right? And then even partnerships where it's like these are the existing ones, and then these are the ones that I know about that I'm going to plan on developing a relationship with. But it is sort of, I think, just even through this process, getting an idea of who the community is and who the players are in it, I think was really important for our project in general. Like how do we sort of integrate with the larger community, not just in LA, but I also have like a list of you know, potential partners in Asia, right? Because I travel to Asia a lot. So how do I sort of start doing that with them? So for our project, I think it's a little bit different because we were going for breadth rather than depth. Like I think Stephen and JK, your projects are more sort of based in partnerships where you're really able to engage them. Ours is more like, you know, queer people, we're everywhere. So it's like, how do we sort of make more like weak ties with community partners, but keep them engaged at the same time. So
Thank you for actually bringing up your old application, Cynthia. I know it must feel like 1,000 years.
it is. I'm just like because when you asked that, I'm like, what did I even write? It's because we're 2 years out. We haven't had funding for 2 years, and this is something that I did actually want to address is I feel like getting the funding set us up. We had so much tech, so we came in as a development grant. We had the project going, and one of the big things when we got this grant and we looked at our site was, oh my gosh, we need to update all of our stacks. So going back to like giving sort of JK, you were talking about skill sharing. Like one of the things that is sort of maintained for us is me and my co-PI Zachary Vernon, who is an art professor. Like I'm communication studies, we have no tech skills whatsoever, and so all of the tech expertise of how the site works lies with our students and our alumni and people who are not us. So it is kind of an interesting space where we're 2 years without funding. And I think when we had the site, we had to they said they had to update the stacks. That's really all I know about what's going on with it. But apparently the site just was minimally functional and by updating it, we were able to sort of build in, I guess, the tools that integrated with more modern tech, like digital technology. I'm not really sure of the tech lingo. My job really was to like give our team the means to sort of do the tech. But 2 years out, we're still going. We have a team, we have a tech team of students. They're going through the site right now, trying to learn what the site is about. And then on the content end, we're still looking at partnerships. What we really want to do is actually, because the mapping, our tech site, it can be sort of used for anything. It doesn't have to be queer mapping, right? And so our hope is to be able to create this technology in a way that anyone can sort of clone it and then use it for whatever purposes they want. So that's sort of like 2 years later, what are we doing?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I don't know if we'll have time to talk about that, but I do find the kind of incorporating students, right, into how you are going about developing a project as part, a really, critical part of the capacity building component of it as well. But I'm curious about like how the students also, teach other members of the team to sort of maintain the site once they graduate, because they are a transitory, population in that way, and how, teaching students is part of skill sharing, but how can your students also teach you and train you in different tools or methods that can help you and can help the sustainability of the project. I want to switch gears just a little bit because one of the benefits of having the three of you talk about your projects is that you've also served in prior competitions as reviewers for this program, right? So you kind of have a sense of, on the one hand, crafting application materials, but then on the other hand, reading and evaluating application materials, especially with respect to thinking about the kind of fit for a project for this program, and sort of thinking through, again, that relationship between the content and the digital tool or the method, but also how that informs or reflects the larger values around digital justice. And so what are sort of, I guess, 1 to 2 considerations that you could share, very generally? Obviously, you don't want to talk about specific applications that you've seen, but 1 to 2 general considerations that, inform how you read an application of a digital project for this particular program, so a digital justice project, versus if you were just sort of, reading a digital humanities project. And I hate to sort of create this false category of traditional DH because that sounds a little bit like an oxymoron, but are there sort of special considerations for this program that inform, how you read and evaluate applications that you think folks applying should be aware of?
I can think of one that comes to mind really quickly. It's that purpose should precede method. So the means you're using to achieve the end are secondary to the end. Like you have to integrate and explain why you need this particular technology or method or form of presentation to, serve the ends of digital justice. Working in machine learning and AI, the changes and the developments within the field are so rapid, there's a tendency to chase every shiny object and just want to apply something for the sake of applying it. But that I don't, in my mind, doesn't reach the threshold that kind of fits within the aims of the program. So you have to have that transformational goal ahead of those technological choices, or at least be able to explain how your technological choices serve that goal rather than determine that goal. That's a really, I think, really important part of a successful application.
I think the same is true even with content goals and content intentions. I think that there are sometimes situations, and I deal with this, as that, you know, the radical, critical is sort of conflated with identity, and it shouldn't be, or with thought that proceeds according to a particular identity. So there are ways in which, one imagines that if the content attends to race, and given what we know about racialism or about racial, then obviously this is doing justice work. But it's important to make that clear and plain. So among the, I guess, components that sometimes give that away, um, like the difference between just a sort of tokenized or surface non-analysis that might be, embedded in your project is the bibliography. It gives a lot. And so too does the budget. And that again that became clarified to me even as an applicant. I was like, oh, this budget, what were we thinking? It doesn't align at all with, or not at all. That's not true, but there were ways that it could have aligned even more powerfully, more clearly with what we were trying to do politically and intellectually. So again, I'd expect to see a bibliography that gestured toward a critical or reparative perspective, like, and not just about the subject of the project, but even saying also the digital tools and methods being used. Um, so, for example, if somebody is proposing the creation of some kind of digital accessibility tool, then the politics of accessibility need to be made clear. And that needs to be made clear in what you're reading or what you're citing or what you're explaining. Explain how they align with disability justice principles. Make sure you're not like conflating accessibility with efficiency, which is a troublesome concept that facilitates all manner of unjust systems. So there's that. And then there's also like bibliographies that include so-called expertise, if we want to use that kind of language, which is a little bit troubling, but knowledge from a wide swath of sources, not just necessarily academic ones. So again, to take seriously the kind of redistribution of epistemic power, even at the point of the application itself. And then lastly, appropriateness of scope. So I love so much saying creative and ambitious pieces, but I feel like the humility of modesty. Um, and I mean, it's, again, we're so new to this. I mean, the process humbles us. But even trying to do something with a sense of purpose that is made clear tends to go with, being like forthright and honest and reflective about abilities of scope. A lot of times those.
So yeah, all of that I think is what when I was reviewing I was looking for. I was also trying to just really vaguely think about all of the criteria that we were asked to evaluate the grants against. And so I really looked for, and again, the ones that I really focused on was how feasible is it, right? Is it feasible? Do you have the tools? Tell in the grant, what are the tools that you have? If you don't have the tools, how are you going to get it, right? So we're looking at feasibility. You can have pie in the sky ideas. If you can't do it, funding's not going to, it's not going to help, right? Um, I was looking for how are you engaging community? So this is Jackie, you were talking about the budget. And one of the things that I remember looking at is in your budget, if you're talking about engaging community, how much of your budget is allocated to actual community versus sort of putting it toward the tech tools. So just the distribution of the budget I was really looking at. I was also looking at just like data ethics and data protection. Long-term sustainability was something else because the grant period is going to end, right? So what is your plan to continue the project after the grant period ends? Is this a project where it's like it's funded and then it's going to go away? Is there a long-term sustainability plan, or is there a plan to sunset the project too? And I think that that's something that we should talk about is these digital projects. How do we sort of sunset them, or what is sort of like the temporal scope, right? How long should they sort of be around, and having some thought around that. Um, I, I really appreciate clarity. Like that's something that I really like, just clear writing, clear. I don't like a lot of jargon. I don't like a lot of like huge words and stuff. Just like tell, because you're probably doing something that I may not have an expertise in. So tell me really clearly, what are you doing? What are you trying to achieve with the funding that you're seeking, right? I was looking at how will the public access it. So if you have like if you're doing a digital archive or something, right? Where is it going to live? How are you going to sort of how are you going to let the public know about it? Will there be public forums? Will there be workshops? For our thing, we had posting parties, right? We're actually currently doing some like user research on how people are using the site that we have. So how are you sort of engaging with not just the not just maybe the specific community that you're sort of doing this project for, but how will you also share what you're doing with the public? And then finally, I think one of the biggest questions that I was looking for was sort of the so what question, right? So, okay, you have this cool project, it's great and everything. Okay, so what? So this is more maybe the theoretical. How is your project situated in these sort of maybe broader discourses and conversations around what your topic is, right? Why is this important, right? Why should your project sort of or what did I say? I said, what is the exigence, right? Why does this project need to be funded now? Right? Why is it important to be funded now? So what is sort of like maybe the urgency or the exigence to that? So those are the sort of things that I thought about when I was doing the review.
I say one really quick thing to just to add to the budget piece. Not at all. I mean, I don't want to overdetermine what this can look like. And I'm saying from experience, if you need course release, say you need course release. If you don't, then you won't have it, and then you know have to proceed accordingly. So again, in terms of that like that honesty, it's all right to be honest about what you need.
Yeah, we absolutely built in course release because like I don't know if y'all know at Cal State LA we have like a 4-4 teaching load, and that was just like way too much to, you know, try to handle a project of this size. So, you know, thank you, JK. I think that's a really good point. Build in course release if you need it.
Yeah, and I think, to that point, feasibility is one of the, areas that reviewers evaluate in terms of reading an application and the extent to which, your timeline or your work plan is a little bit too ambitious. And within the context of this, I often think of too ambitious as like, are you yourselves as the project team taking care of yourselves as you do this work? Because if that's not also, built in and considered, obviously we don't want you to burn yourself out in terms of doing this. And as ACLS, you are our primary beneficiaries of the scholars that we are supporting. So that is of concern to us as well. But also just making sure that the project is done in the way that is best reflective of, the values that you're espousing in the application. And so that question around labor and what that looks like and making sure that you kind of have a sense of what that looks like for your project team is really important. So we are coming up on 20 minutes. I know that there's some questions in the chat that I'm going to try to answer via chat. But if there are questions, particularly around eligibility, I encourage you to email us at digitaljustice@acls.org. We appreciate your patience. There are two of us sort of manning the inbox. And as you can imagine, with all of the federal funding cuts, we've gotten a lot more interest in not only this program, but across all of ACLS's programs. And so we will get to your question. And so I want to use this time to allow folks who have questions, particularly for our interlocutors, to share that in the chat, or if you could use the hand raising feature if you want to sort of provide some context for your question. Again, because we are short on time, I ask that the context for the question be brief. But if it's anything related to some of the things we talked about today in terms of thinking through this question of digital justice, how does that show up in your project? What kinds of considerations you have for the kinds of digital tools or methods that you use, thinking about community partnerships and how to articulate that within your application, thinking about questions of labor. We welcome those questions now.
There's one that I'm seeing. What kinds of organizations count as community partners for the purposes of this grant?
Mm-hmm.
So happy to yield it.
So as I said, it can be a wide variety of organizations. It really depends on what your project is and what you're doing. one distinction that I will make in terms of partnership versus like bringing in a consultant, for example. So Cynthia was talking about having someone come in for, let's say you need technical expertise to help you build out some of the infrastructure of the project. That doesn't necessarily count as a partner in the same way, because there's a sort of clearly defined task that they have been brought on to support the project in that way. When I think of partnership, I think about it in the literal sense of the term, insofar as an equitable distribution of labor that's forwarding the project, who is involved in kind of framing the project intellectually, where ultimately is that project going to live, in terms of the data, right? Where's the locus of activity happening with that project? And so when I think about ownership, I think about, or when I think about partnership, rather, I think about ownership, right? And so I want to be clear about the necessity for letters if you have partners versus if you're bringing in a consultant to do specific delineated tasks.
Oh, there's one that I think we didn't address, which is how is ACLS defining what interpretive social sciences means?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I saw that one. So I actually love the framing of that, because I might have to edit this out of the recording, but interpretive social sciences as a phrase doesn't really make sense to me personally, because I think of all social sciences as interpretive. And so I have since, and I think as an organization, we've moved away from that language for precisely that reason. And so if you look at I think the general information session, I just said social sciences and have been saying social sciences. But we do value a kind of social science practice that's also very much engaged with humanistic inquiry and humanistic disciplines. And so I think that, you know, if you're obviously like a sociologist, or if you're in economics, like the projects that are typically funded through this program, and then I think that ACLS tends to fund, are social science projects that also sort of, you know, incorporate the humanities and humanistic frameworks and methodologies in particular ways. And so to answer your question, I don't know that interpretive social sciences as a phrase means much for me and for this program. And so if you're in the social sciences, you're eligible to apply. I also think too, for what it's worth, given the fact that this is a program that supports digital work, it's so hard to kind of make a clear distinction around interpretive social sciences, right? Because there are plenty of folks who apply who have more technically oriented backgrounds. So folks in computer science, for example, who will partner with a sociologist. And so they've, you know, proposed really great projects in such instances and are still eligible to apply. And so again, if you have any doubts about your own particular case in your project, then we, you know, welcome you to email us so we can think a little bit more critically about your particular situation. But we welcome folks in the social sciences to apply. So we will make this recording available on the ACLS Digital Justice website. My colleague is reminding me that I have a survey to share with you all. So part of what we like to do is to get feedback from our attendees to actually make sure that these sessions are useful in ways that we should, you know, improve, or different things that we can sort of incorporate into subsequent sessions. And so if you can follow this link and submit some answers to our short survey. There's, I think, 5 or 6 questions we would greatly appreciate it. We do take your feedback very, very seriously and try to incorporate that into subsequent iterations of the program. And so thank you so much. I want to close out by thanking our interlocutors. This is a really large crowd today, so I appreciate everyone's patience in terms of getting their questions answered, but also just listening, hearing about these wonderful projects. But also I hope that this provided some insight, little peeling back the curtain in some ways behind the review process that will be helpful to you all as you navigate your application and navigate this competition season. So thank you all, and I wish you the rest of the afternoon.
Thank you.